we'll see that now. So I'm Thomas Hesselburg. I'm a lecturer at Oxford Life Learning, or the Department for Continued Education. I'm going to talk quite a bit about sort of spiders, but also I want to just talk a little bit about caves in general, because caves are actually quite overlooked habitats in general, I think. And obviously, as you probably know, there's lots of spiders in caves. So it's also a sort of recommendation, I guess, for people to, when they are out and looking at spiders, if there are caves in the vicinity, do pop in and have a quick look. I mean, a torch will usually do the trick, at least for the initial part of the cave, and there will be quite a lot of interesting stuff. And indeed, the spiders that I'm talking about are mainly found at the sort of close to the entrance of the caves. But then I'm specifically going to talk about the menardi and its sort of quite interesting and unique webs and foraging behavior. And then I'm going to talk about the other meta spider, bourneti, and how we've been looking a little bit into sort of invasive, not really invasive, but non-native adaptations that this spider might have compared to its native range. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about, just highlight a few other weird, but really fascinating behaviors of these spiders. Okay, but first, as I said, a little bit about the sort of the caves themselves. So as you probably appreciate, caves are really characterized by a lack of light, especially as you go further into the cave. At the very entrance zone, there's a little bit of sunlight, but as you go further in, they become really, really dark. So there's very, very limited primary production, certainly really none as you go deeper into the cave. They're also characterized by quite stable environmental conditions. So we have quite stable temperatures, and we typically have very high humidity inside of those. So as I said, I'm just going to come back to the zone. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about them now. But basically, we split it up. We can split up a cave into 3 zones. They are rather loosely defined in that they usually define the entrance zone, the first couple of meters, where you still get some direct sunlight at some point during the day, and then about sort of a couple of meters into 20 to 30 meters into the cave, there will still be a little bit of light, and it's typically sort of defined very scientifically as if you stand for a while, turn off your torch and hold your hand out. If you can see anything after your eyes have acclimatized, then you're in the twilight zone. If you can't, you're in the dark zone. So these kind of lack of nutrients in particular, but also the lack of light, of course, leads to a number of sort of different conditions in caves compared to the outside. So first of all, the lack of nutrients means that we generally have far fewer individuals, but also far fewer species inside a cave. So it's quite sort of, scarce with what you see of life in there. The insular nature of the cave, so basically lots of the cave species that live there do not venture outside, so there can be very large barriers to dispersal and really low gene flow. So you often get sort of weird and wonderful adaptations, which leads to endemic species. Indeed, there's some species that are found in just one cave, for example. So for this reason, in general, caves can be viewed as a sort of natural laboratories to understand ecological and evolutionary processes. So basically understanding quite complex processes in a simplified environment, so you can control lots of the variables in there. There's also, I guess, what's really interesting and particularly perhaps for this talk is the sort of adaptations we see in the species that are adapted to these situations. So basically we have this kind of morphological adaptations and quite sort of logical, perhaps. One of the adaptations is lack of eyes or reduction in eyes, so they obviously don't need to, or they can't see anything in the dark. So we get these kind of species that lack eyes. We also lack pigment in many of these species lack pigment as well. So we get these kind of white species, and then we have elongation of limbs and other sort of sensory structures happening. Physiological adaptations, similar, we have quite a lot of those. So particularly, again, as I said, because vision is not being used, we get improved sensitivity in other types of sensory systems. There's typically increased capacity for fat storage and basically lower metabolic rate, allowing these individuals to survive longer without access to food. So in general, longer lifespan, the whole metabolic systems, the whole life history happens at a slower rate, broadening diet, and typically sort of larger investment into eggs and young. So fewer young, but larger investment into those. So what I'm mainly going to talk about today is the last categories of behavioral adaptations in cave organisms. That is something we do know quite a bit less about, because whereas we can, at least the morphological adaptations are quite easy to study. We can just capture an individual, kill it in a trap or whatever, and then study it. Obviously, with behaviors, it's much more difficult. You basically need to observe, capture and observe, or observe in the cave a lot of different species and follow them. And caves are not particularly easy environments or easy habitats to conduct long-scale behavioral studies in. But nonetheless, we do have some general trends emerging when we look at across the literature on many different species. So we generally find less complex anti-predator behavior. So in general, because there's fewer species, there's also fewer predators for most of these species. And indeed, whereas in the outside habitat, you will have an apex predator, so the main predator in an ecosystem being something large, mammal or bird, typically. In caves, often is the spiders, for example, that are the main largest predators in a cave. So you do get quite a number of reduced larger predators and reduced predation in general. You also get reduced complex social structures. So again, animals don't tend to interact much socially in caves. And finally, you have this sort of broader, more generalistic, opportunistic foraging behavior, basically. So because there's so little prey, it doesn't really pay off to be too specialized in what you're eating. You're going to have to sort of just try and eat whatever you are finding, basically. Okay, so just a few sort of definitions here. So I don't worry too much about them. It's all sort of scientific subfields like to have definitions for different things. But in caves, we do talk about at least 3 groups of different organisms we can find in caves. So the trogloscenes are really animals that are just entering the cave for a very short period of time, sometimes by accident, but sometimes because they're seeking refuge or as a random hibernation spot. So that could be something like butterflies and some moths we tend to find in caves. Troglophile is the next step up, so they will typically be found a little bit deeper inside the caves, and those are animals that are spending a significant part of their life in caves and dependent caves to some extent, at least for some of the population. But they also spend time outside, or they have populations that can be found outside as well. So they may show some behavioral and physiological adaptations, but typically don't show any morphological adaptations. Then the final and last sort of group are the true cave adapted species. So they spend all their life in caves and they show these strong morphological and physiological adaptations that I talked about earlier. So just out of interest, we do have one spider in the UK. There's pictures of that down here. So Porhoma rosenhauri from caves in Wales that are actually a true troglobiont. So there's other really interesting cave spiders that I'm not going to talk about today, but just wanted to highlight that. What I will talk about are 3 orb spiders, so 3 troglophiles, orb spiders that we found in cave. And when we think about it, it might be quite surprising to find an orb spider in a cave, because as I said, they do live in the twilight zone. It is very dark. There is very little flying prey. And as we all know, obviously orb spiders intercept prey with their orb webs that are flying, and then they capture and consume this one. So it is perhaps quite surprising that we can find sort of relatively common orb spiders in caves. So it's from 2 different genera. I'm not going to talk about Metellina marianae much, or actually not at all apart from now, because although it is often found in caves, it's also found elsewhere. So it's found in really dark and damp conditions, such as in forests as well. And as far as we tested, and we have looked at least at the sort of webs, they do not show any form of behavioral adaptations to the cave environment. However, the 2 metaspecies are really of interest because they do show quite striking behavioral adaptations. And one of the most obvious and striking adaptations they show is in their webs. So if you can see, they still build in orb webs, as you can see the menardi web on the right, so B, and a standard Metellina web in this case, so closely related tetraneated web on the left. So as you can see, the webs are reduced both in size, but in particularly in complexity as well. So they have fewer number of spirals, they have fewer number of radii, but most strikingly perhaps is that they have very, very few sort of frame threads. So the frame threads are the ones that encapsulate the web. So it was quite intriguing. We're not the first ones that noticed this kind of weird webs, but we were the first ones that sort of probably went in and quantifying this kind of these kind of webs. So it was quite intriguing. Why do they have so different webs? Is this perhaps a behavioral adaptation to living in caves? Well, one thing could be maybe it's not really an adaptation for caves per se. It's just because caves are quite sort of enclosed spaces, and there's certainly some evidence from other spiders that when you put their webs in very limited space, they will adapt their web to fit the space. And we've seen in another Tetragnathus or Leucauca from the tropics that basically also removes frame threads in these ones. However, this is only done when they're extremely size limited in a lab situation. It's not the case of meta, of course, that they're necessarily that enclosed. There is open space in the caves. They do have orb web that extend into the cave interior as well. Also, the closely related Tetragnathids to the meta spiders do not show much behavioral flexibility. And finally, we have looked into whether the spider's web changes depending on where they're found in the cave. So we've gone sort of along from starting at the first couple of meters and then into the end, 20, 30 meters into the cave where we can still find them. And we did not find any difference in how their webs are structured in that context. So it sounds unlikely that this is caused by some kind of behavioral flexibility and because of space constraints. Indeed, I've kept a few spiders in my garage as well that also build webs with missing frame threads and looking very much similar to these ones as well. Another piece of the puzzle perhaps is when we look at their diet. So basically they do capture flying prey. So there is some prey that they will capture and fly. So there is obviously something flying in caves, which we can also see if we go there, particularly fungus gnats, small dipterans. But the vast majority of their prey seems to be non-flying prey. So isopods, myriapods, slugs and snails in some cases, other spiders and beetles. So again, this is highly unusual for an orb spider to have a diet consisting mainly of non-flying prey. I mean, as far as I'm aware, most, if not all, outside spiders build orb webs and they just capture things that fly into their orb webs. So how do they capture these non-flying prey? So there's three sort of hypotheses we could think of, and one of them, the first one, is the one that's traditionally given in the literature, so the off-web hunting hypothesis. So basically it's thought the spiders simply leave their web and go and hunt things crawling on the wall. A second hypothesis could be the prey slip hypothesis. So basically they have the webs and things crawling around near the web loses their footing and drop into the web. And then the final one is the radius tripwire hypothesis, and that's the one where we try to link the sort of type of web with the kind of hunting strategy. So basically, I'm going to give details of that in a minute, so wait for that. But just very briefly, just running through the three hypotheses. So off-web hunting hypothesis, they leave the web. As I said, there's quite a lot of that mentions in the literature, but there's actually very little evidence to support this. There's very few observations of spiders in caves walking around on the walls with prey. So there's quite a few spiders that just sits on the wall, and males as well will be walking around the wall, but we do not really observe them with prey. So that seems quite unlikely. They would also have to severely adapt their prey hunting strategy to sort of overcome things completely outside of the web compared to using the web to some extent. There are a couple of Pachygnatha, of course, and some Hawaiian Tetragnatha as well that have done that. So it's not completely out of the possibility that they could adapt their prey capture strategy in this way, but we don't believe that really to be the case because there's very little evidence for that, as I said. The second hypothesis is probably more likely to some extent. So prey are walking around in caves, probably occasionally do fall into the webs. The webs are more horizontally inclined. So again, that could suggest that they're more adapted to things falling up and down. So similar with the T280 spiders that build webs near pond, for example, are very horizontally inclined so they can capture prey emerging from the water or flying down towards the water. So this is a possibility. But again, it's difficult to imagine that they will get enough food with that strategy because prey is quite scarce. It is quite rare, probably, that cave, especially cave-adapted species, would lose their footing and just happen to fall into a web. So although this might be a contributor, we don't think this is the main way they're capturing on flying prey. The last one, though, the radius tripwire hypothesis, is really where we're saying that the radii, now they don't have frames, as I said, so the radii individually attach to the cave walls or cave ceilings, basically giving a lot of attachment points of the web, unlike a standard web, which has the frame and then maybe have 4 to 5 anchor threads that connect it to the vegetation. So basically, we think maybe they operate a little bit like primitive trapdoor spiders in that something walking by touches one of these attached radii and basically alert that to the spider sitting in the set. Again, this is not a complete novel hypothesis from us. Peter Smithers, which some of you might know, have actually done some quite interesting lab studies with a student that demonstrate that they do seem to be sitting in the web, then leaving and capturing isopods and returning to them. Unfortunately, he did not publish any of this stuff, but I've had the pleasure of talking to him about it, and so there is some evidence for this. But also in nature, in the actual cave, we recently made some observations to support this hypothesis, and I hope this video will play. So it's not a very high quality video. It's quite difficult to record in case, but you might see the arrow there pointed to the spider, and then there is a centipede. You can kind of see it down there on the wall. The spider attacks the centipede, but do not complete the attack, possibly because centipedes are actually quite dangerous prey to pursue. So we think it probably gave up at the point it got contact with it. We saw another observation as well where they did the similar kind of behavior with another spider that we had scared, so a similar sized spider. Again, they went down, attacked, but aborted the attack. Again, the spider that they attacked was also a meta spider of similar size to themselves, so they probably at that point again gave up because of potential dangers. But it does seem to suggest that they are utilizing this kind of method for attacking the web. So we will still need to have more observations of this and ideally also confirm some of Peter Smithers' experiments in the lab as well. But it does seem to be the case. Okay, I'm now going to shift a little bit gear and talk about menardi, which is the other meta spider we have in the UK. So that's more based in or more found in the south, whereas menardi is found everywhere. It's also thought that menardi is clearly native, but bourneti might very well not be native. It was first recorded in the UK in 1941. That's not necessarily in itself because the species was first described, I think, just prior to that as different from menardi. So it doesn't necessarily show that it was first found in the UK at that point, but it does potentially indicate that the species could have been brought with wine from France or other places where it's sort of native in Central and Southern Europe. So what we really wanted to see is, does this spider basically show differences? First of all, how does it compare to menardi, but also is it different from other populations of bourneti in its native range? So we had some evidence that something was going on because I did an earlier study using the BAS spider recording scheme data actually to look at the habitat in the UK of observations of these spiders in the UK of what kind of habitat they were found. And if we compare the two species, bourneti in light gray and menardi in dark, we can see that actually, although bourneti is a cave spider, it's actually not found very often in caves in the UK. It's found much more often in artificial habitats, whereas menardi is found much more often in caves and very rarely in other situations. I think Brandon has left now, but I was quite interested to see that he had one observations of a menardi on a fence, I think, in Cork, which is quite interesting because that's certainly not a habitat I would have expected to find that kind of spider. So I also did compare bourneti from data elsewhere in Europe and looked at where was it found in its native range. Again, we see basically all observations, almost all observations coming from caves in its native range, whereas in the UK, as we saw from the other one, it's found much more in artificial habitats. So something interesting seems to be happening here, although I should say Europe doesn't have quite the good kind of data that we have. We're lucky to have with the BAS recording scheme. So it was a little bit more difficult to get reliable data, and probably much more data in Central Europe was from professional scientists, and indeed probably much more people from cave explorer, cave sort of biologists. So it's perhaps not 100% conclusion that the spider is not found elsewhere in the rest of Europe, but at least the kind of clear differences suggest that some kind of habitat shift is going on. So last year we started a project with an MBio student of mine, Levi Welch, who basically attempted to look at questions as if they show these habitat differences, are there any differences in their behavior as well? So we basically decided to compare both the sort of the web structure, but also their actual prey capture behaviors or boldness in a way. And the way we did that is using tuning fork. And if you haven't done already, tuning forks are really a great really great to go out when you look at spiders, because you can basically put a tuning fork to a web, and particularly, not exclusively, but particularly orb spiders are great at responding to this as though it's a prey. So you basically just put the tuning fork into the web, and as soon as it touches almost, the spider will respond by, as you can see, turning towards it and then running. So basically initiating a standard prey capture behavior. So what you can actually do as well is using different kind of frequency tuning forks as well. So the 440 tuning frequency will, for example, be simulating the wing beat frequency of kind of small prey, fast flying small prey, fungus, gnats, and small flies. Whereas a lower frequency tuning fork, so it's a 128 one, will be simulating much larger prey, so hornets, wasps, and potentially also quite dangerous prey for the spider. So there's an element as well of how bold they will be in different situations and deciding to attack the lower frequency tuning fork. So the study we compared with was in Sardinia, because we had some contacts there. So we compared natural caves in Sardinia with artificial habitats in the UK. And obviously, it would be much better to compare artificial habitats in Sardinia as well with artificial habitats in the UK, and natural caves in the UK with natural caves in Sardinia. But one of the findings of the study is actually we were not able to find bourneti in artificial habitats in Sardinia at all, although we did look at quite similar habitats that we used in the UK. And in the UK, similar, we were not able to find it in natural caves at all. So the few observations that I had from the other paper that they are in natural caves, we were not able to verify. We were not able to see it there. Where we did find it in extremely high densities was in Highgate Cemetery in London, in the crypts and in the catacombs. Basically, we were able to find really a lot of them. We also found them a few other areas around southern UK. So very quickly, the sort of the results. Basically, in terms of the webs, we did not find any difference. The web geometry was very similar across Sardinia and UK populations. And indeed, the webs are very similar to menardi as well. So they show the exact same behavioral adaptations that I showed of the web structure in here. We did, though, find a few differences when it came to looking at the behavior. So here you can see the results of the two tuning forks of 440 and 128 on whether they attack, they don't respond, or they escape. And we have Sardinia to the left and then UK to the right. So we did actually compare two different UK kind of populations, because, as I said, Highgate Cemetery, we were looking at the catacombs where we find much of them, but the catacombs are actually fairly disturbed areas because the symmetry has guided tours of people, not to look at the spiders, I'm afraid, but to look at the coffins and and everything else that's in there. So we did quickly compare with crypts as well, and compare with other sites in the UK where there were not sort of standard tours, but there was no difference between disturbed and undisturbed habitats in the UK. So we combined those results. So basically what we can see is that when we compare to Sardinia, that 440 Hertz tuning forks seems quite similar. So they attack more or less with the same rate as sort of small prey. But when it comes to larger and potentially dangerous prey, there does seem to be a difference in that the UK populations are much more likely to attack, much less likely to escape or not respond to larger prey. So again, what that actually means potentially means that in artificial habitats, there is probably more larger flying prey, and therefore they have adapted their behavior to potentially pursue that into a higher level than they have in a natural habitat. It's also worth mentioning that the population densities in artificial habitats in the UK are far higher than they are in natural caves in Sardinia, probably because of the high available prey rate. Okay, so that was a sort of two quick overviews of some of the behaviors we looked at. There's also quite a lot of other really interesting behaviors that they're showing that I haven't had a chance to look at yet. So their life history is really interesting. They're thought to leave the caves as part of their life history. So in the second and fourth instar, they leave the caves, go outside, construct webs, and then come back into caves. Presumably they do this by ballooning, although it's not really good evidence of this. There is some good evidence that they are that they prefer light in those instars, so they will be attracted towards light, whereas in all other instars, they are repelled by light. So it does seem probably correct that they do leave the cave. I haven't been able to see them outside, but obviously at the third and fourth instar, they're probably quite difficult to tell from other potentially orb spiders, and obviously not being adult, it's difficult to verify what kind of species they are. But if anybody see anything they think is a meta spider and a young instar outside of caves, do please let me know. I'm also quite interested in when they do go outside, how do they actually find their way back into caves? So is it because maybe not all of the population, all of the young leave the caves, some stay behind, and those are the ones that develop? Or is it much easier to find a cave than perhaps I think? So caves are quite fairly rare and isolated things that can be quite difficult to find, I would have thought, if you were a spider. But maybe, I mean, obviously, if they go outside, there must be some kind of strategy that allows them to come back at least to some kind of habitat where they can reproduce. So that is an interesting behavior. We have also seen some quite interesting examples of sort of males looking like females. So you can see that picture here. So on the left, we have a standard male, very long legs, small abdomen, as we know from many spiders. And then on the right, we can see it's a male, enhanced pedipalps, but the phenotype of that spider is much more like a female with larger abdomen and not quite as long legs relative to the other ones. So again, we don't know anything about their mating behavior at all. As far as I'm aware, no matings have ever been observed of these spiders. We do see males. They're rarer than females, but we do find males, but they don't seem to be mate guarding like the related Metallina does. And as far as we, as I said, we haven't managed to see any kind of mating behavior. So again, probably some quite interesting aspects to study there. Okay, I'm coming to an end now. So cave spiders, as I said, really quite interesting to look at, both because they're spiders and they show interesting behavior, but also as a general model system for trying to understand how perhaps organisms from the outside adapt to live in a quite unusual and in some way extreme habitats, such as a cave. Bourneti as well is quite interesting to look at as a potential species that are perhaps slowly adapting to becoming to a new environment, and basically just showing this kind of habitat shift potentially, and then slowly adapting its behavior to sort of new types of prey and new type of habitat. But yeah, we know very little about these spiders in general. All right, thank you very much for your attention, and sorry, sort of perhaps took a little bit longer. Try to do it fairly quickly though, hopefully not too quickly. But I should just say thank you for the students, mainly sort of MBio students at Oxford that's been doing these kind of things. So Levi, we talked about Emily as well, and Daniel have been all collecting this kind of data. I worked with Enrico in Sardinia, and particularly on getting access, and he and his team was extremely helpful. He's helping us to find the caves and the spiders in there. I should also thank for funding. So BAS particularly was helpful with the Miss Bourneti study, whereas the John Fell Fund from Oxford was helping with the Miss menardi, and I also got funding from the Breeze Cave Research Association. All right, thank you very much. I will stop sharing now. Are there any
Thomas,
questions?
well, I'm sure there are, and well, I know there are. There are some up on the screen. So, Thomas, many, many thanks. Really fascinating, um, and really interesting. And even with a spider that is, and if people aren't familiar with Meta, these when they are adult are incredibly impressive spiders. With a leg span probably of 2 to 3 inches in size. Here in Buckinghamshire, I have quite a lot of experience of finding bourneti. There are no caves in Buckinghamshire, or not at least that I'm aware of, but in a whole variety of very interesting habitats, they can be very common. So, um, I think the first site that I was called to look at was actually to a Clargister, which is a sewage treatment tank, a bit like but above ground, in Langley Park near Slough. And there were, I wouldn't say hundreds, but certainly 50 plus Meta bourneti in what was a fairly large Clargister tank inside the lid. Tank was probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 meters across, but huge numbers. And in ducts and culverts and whatever else around the same estate, pretty much every time you open the lid to that, again, Meta bourneti. For those up in the West Midlands, if you've ever been to the Black Country Museum, which is quite a very popular, famous attraction. If you ever take a ride on the canal boat that takes you through some old tunnels, fairly well lit, but on the walls of those tunnels at Black Country Museum, again, there are meta species. I wasn't able to reach up and grab a specimen, so I wouldn't be certain that it's bourneti or menardi, but nevertheless, for those in the West Midlands, that might be something worth looking at. But fantastic spiders, huge spiders, and for a species that is evident when you see it, it's surprising that we still know so little about them. Particularly, we don't know how they mate. So, Thomas, really, really interesting. Thank you. Right, so some questions. Alice Bennett West again. We've a cave nearby to where she is with a large number of Metaminardi. I've just been looking back at a video and photos I've taken, and a great deal of them rest on the walls of the cave with a leg stretched out onto their web rather than hanging out on the web itself. There are also fairly high numbers of moths, particularly in the winter. So after listening to your talk, Thomas, I'm not sure there's anything you want to add to that, but she's very keen to go back and observe more about them.
Yeah, no, that's great. As I said, we really need more people to have a look at those. There's undoubtedly really fascinating things being found. So it is true. Lots of the time, the spiders are sitting on. So a little bit like we know with Shigella and other type of spiders, they're not sitting in the hop of their web necessarily all the time. They can be found in sort of sitting in the vicinity of the web, but they will have a thread leading up to the web, and they will. So when we use the, sort of the tuning forks in this, we can sort of lure them onto the web by spraying them with some water, for example. They will come onto the web, and then we can use the tuning forks. But yeah, there's some really interesting examples of them. But again, if there's lots of them, and if you see if you see any kind of mating behavior, or if you observe where the males are compared to the females, be very interested to hear more about those observations. So I think my email address was in the front, or you can Google me. As I said, I'm really keen on any kind of observations, particularly if people notice more of these potentially female looking males. I'd be very interested to know about that.
Okay. Jeff has put up, Brian Pennington showed many years ago that younger instars spend time out of mini caves, and that correlated with them having bold color and patterns. This coloration disappeared when they moved back into caves. Have you found the same?
Yeah, as I said, we haven't really observed them outside. I mean, I know that the juveniles looks quite different to the adults, but at least in the earlier instars. I don't actually know how the third and fourth instar looks, so I haven't come across that particularly study. But that does sound interesting in terms, and maybe I think it's just a case of people not realizing that those are meta spiders in those instars, and that's why there's so few observations of them from the outside. So we don't, for example, know whether they build normal orb webs outside, which I'd be very interested to know. My suggestion would be if it's a behavioral adaptation, they probably do build normal orb webs, so with all the frame threads outside, but it would be very nice to be able to verify that the juvenile webs are standard orb webs when being built outside.
Okay, Helen has Smith, that is, said, is there any extent to which the habitat separation between the two species in the UK is a result of competitive exclusion of bourneti by menardi?
Yeah.
Separately, some time ago, someone told me they'd seen meta spiderlings migrating towards the entrance of a Peak District cave. I'll try and backtrack.
Yes, so those are really interesting, and that is a really good question actually. And we have not directly looked into it, but there is some evidence from elsewhere that menardi is actually a superior competitor. So as far as we've seen across Europe, they're never found in the same caves, the two meta spiders. So there's clearly some kind of exclusion going on, and it does seem like menardi is the better competitor. So in its native range, menardi is excluded from the cave bourneti is found in because of the temperature and sort of humidity. So menardi requires more humid caves. So what you tend to find in Central Europe, for example, is an altitudinal gradient with menardi at the bottom of sort of mountains, and then menardi higher up. So what could be happening in the UK is it is likely that, or possible at least, that bourneti is not found in caves because it's being competitively excluded by menardi. I don't know. I mean, there's many caves where there's no menardi, right? So menardi, although it is very common in caves, it's not found in all caves. Don't fully understand why, but it could, as I said, relate to slight differences in humidity of the caves as well, or that they just never found those caves. So I would still potentially expect bourneti to find and live in some kind of caves in the UK, but as I said, we were not really able to show that. So again, if some people do find bourneti in caves, please do let me know, because we did look at some of the sites in the previous recording scheme and we were not able to find the spiders there. There was one cave where they reported from where we did find bourneti, but what we found it, I mean, it was a sort of a visitor type cave. So where we found it was right at the entrance zone, building on the wood scaffolding that were right at the start of the cave. So we didn't count that as a being natural cave situation. Forgot the other question now, which was also really interesting.
And the extent, the other thing was about, wasn't a question, it was just something that Helen had reported. Meta spiderlings migrating towards
Yeah.
in the Peak District.
Yeah, I'll be very interested to hear more about that. So as I said, there is quite good evidence that they are attracted to light at that stage, and we do see it. But we do also, I mean, I do find quite often lots of juvenile in caves, but whether then that's the very early instars before they migrate out is sort of difficult to tell. When we seem to have found meta spiders in all different kind of instars in the cave, but because of Metallina meriani, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to determine whether juvenile is a juvenile Metallina meriani or a juvenile meta. So we're not 100% sure.
And to that, it was more a statement rather than a question. But Barry Chadwick said he'd found a meta spiderling in a bush at the side of a bus stop on a main road. But I guess probably to that point, very difficult, I guess, to separate or determine accurately that that's a meta rather than a Metallina species. But yeah, I would say, Barry, take down Thomas's email address, and if you want to send that sighting to him, please do so. Alice, you've posted a picture. I'd say exactly the same. Send it directly to Thomas after the meeting. Francis, you've raised a hand. Is that for any particular?
I recorded Meta Bourneti It was actually on a military range in a Nissen hut, which was very dark. It was very wet inside, but it was extremely hot.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it is found. I think there are some records, maybe it's yours as well, from sort of military installations in. So where was that again? Sorry, I didn't quite.
Where was it
Yeah,
exactly?
yeah.
It's the Paradise Range in Somerset.
Okay, yeah. So because obviously it's quite interesting when we move to the West Country that where there's more menardi, that there is a possibility for more direct interactions and more different direct competitions. But yeah, no, we didn't look at those areas in this particular study, but I'd be quite interested to to look in that part of the country as well. So we look more in around London, East
It
UK.
was it was the temperature that didn't seem right.
Yeah.
It was really, you can imagine a tin hut um, on open ground. It was quite hot inside.
I mean, and that is actually another really interesting question about metabonetti is it thermal tolerance, because metabonetti obviously is found fairly, I mean, okay, there's some observations of it outside, but in general, quite stable temperatures. Metabonetti in Sardinia and other places as well, very sort of relatively stable temperatures, higher than in the UK, right? So found in calcite caves with 20 plus degrees. But in the UK, where they're found in these artificial habitat, I mean, we saw them active down to 0 degrees, right, in winter as well, which is definitely something they would never encounter in their native range. So it is interesting whether they have just a broader thermal tolerance, and that perhaps what allows them also to thrive at very hot conditions. I don't know, but there's some interesting things going on there as well, that's for sure.
And of course there are records, and I forget which species, whether it's bourneti or menardi, in well, man-made structures, obviously, but artificial things like telecoms cabinets and junction boxes and whatever that we see scattered on the streets. Doing our social media accounts, I've also seen records of people discovering them in things like compost bins, where, a lidded compost bin. So,
Yeah, again, that's actually something quite interesting. I'd be quite interested to know because there was some, again, in the newsletter, I think a few years back, some observations of metabonetti in compost bins. So if anybody do have compost bins, don't overlook that as a potential site for interesting spiders, particularly if you are in southern areas, or even if you're near caves, and it could be menardi as well.
great.